Today I wanted to talk about how I get the most out of my paper. I usually use the Hahnemuhl cold pressed watercolor paper. I tend to get the 12 sheet sketchbook instead of the 10 sheet block just because it's a little bit cheaper and you do get more paper from it. I usually go for the one that's 9 inches by 12 inches, but I don't normally paint on 9 by 12 paper. I usually go for an A5 size, which is not as easily found in the US, so I have to cut all of my paper to this A5 size. I found the best way to fit as many A5 size papers into these 9 by 12 pages is to cut horizontally and then horizontally again. That way I actually get 2 little A5 papers out of one paper sheet. So technically, if I'm starting with 12 pages of paper, I actually cut them down and I can have 24 sheets of paper to use. I usually tend to leave 2 or 3 pages uncut just because I do sell commissions that are 8 by 10 or 9 by 12, and I don't want to cut all of my paper down and then have to reorder paper later for a commission. So I usually keep some of those separate, but I cut most of them into this A5 size, and that leaves me with a lot of paper scraps, which you will see here. This is just some of the paper scraps that I've collected throughout cutting these. I used to use them to swatch colors on, but now I use them to create more watercolor paper. So I will take those little paper scraps and I will cut them down even more, which is what you're seeing here. You don't have to make them perfect. They don't have to be all the same size. They just have to generally be smaller than they were. The next thing you'll want to do is soak these little paper bits in water. I poured a bunch of really hot water on them because I didn't want to wait as long. I think I let them sit for about 30 minutes before I moved on to the next phase. Something to note is the higher cotton content in the paper, the more absorbent that it is going to be. You will need a couple of things to create this paper. Some felt or little towels work, and this thing that I can't remember what it's called, but some sort of mesh to drip the water through and catch the paper, and some sort of basin to put the water in, and the paper pulp that will be made in a second. I got my paper making kit from the Sue J Paper Company. They are pretty good and they have a tutorial on YouTube. So to make your paper pulp, you're going to put your soaked paper in a blender or like a smoothie, NutriBullet. That's what I did. You're going to want to make sure that it's about 75% water to about 25% paper so that you don't burn up the motor of whatever you're using to create your pulp. The pulp will look a little bit like a porridge, but you're going to want to take little bits at a time and add it to your basin with some water, and then adjust how much pulp is in there just depending on how thick you want the paper to be when you're all finished. I personally like to stir it up a little bit just because I found that when you place the pulp first in the water, it can kind of be clumpy, and whenever you stir it, it actually separates it a lot better so that it can cover your little paper making thing a lot more evenly. I have officially found out that this little thing that I'm using is actually called the mold and the decal, the decal being the wooden part that creates a deckled edge, or an edge that looks hand-torn. I do not want a deckled edge. I want to make a professional, crisp, clean cut edge, so I'm removing the decal so that I can have a little bit of a bigger sheet of paper. That way I can cut it down to the size that I need. So you just run it under the water, splish splash some of the pulp around on top of it, bring it up, let it drain, and then you're going to pull off the screen, flip it over onto one of those felts or towels, whatever you're using, and you're going to take a sponge, and you are going to sponge dry it and squeeze out all of the water because it needs to be able to dry. The more water you can get off of it, the better, because the less likely it will stick to the screen the drier it is. If it does stick to the screen, you're going to want to be very careful because it will tear very easily. So if it starts to tear, just stick the screen back down, tap it a couple of times, and see if that works. But if it does tear, you're probably going to have to just scrap the whole piece of paper and restart. As you can see, there are little black bits in my paper as I'm making it. This isn't going to be the case with all watercolor papers if you're making more paper from watercolor scraps. Mine has this because Hahnemuhl uses a black, like rubbery glue to actually glue all their pages together. And I did not go through and peel all of that off or cut it off, which I probably should have, but I just didn't. Here you can see that one was a little too thin for my liking, so I am just rolling it off of the little felt and I'm throwing it back into the water, and then I'm going to mix it back into the rest of the water. As you're making paper, you want to make sure that you're adding pulp to the water, because as you're making it, you're actually pulling pulp out of the water. So eventually you're going to get a lot of water and not a lot of pulp. And when that happens, you're going to get thinner and thinner paper. And the paper does dry even thinner than it appears whenever it's wet, because it's not going to have any water in there making it spongier or fuller than it would actually be. If you have a piece of paper that is too thin, you could just scrap it and start over, or you could actually see about making another thin layer and then stacking it on top of that piece and pressing down. That way it combines the two into one. There's no guarantee that it'll stay that way and it won't peel apart, but it would make it a little bit thicker. Once you've made your paper, you're just going to let them dry on the felts overnight until they are dry. Once the paper is dry, which usually it just takes like overnight for that, you are going to peel them off of the felts, and you might see that they are warped. So they're going to be a little crinkly, they're not going to lay super flat. What I recommend that you do is, if you have a hot heat press, you can take them and individually, sheet by sheet, press them in that for a couple of seconds, and that will flatten them out. Or you're going to stack them all up and place several heavy books on top of them and leave that at least overnight. Or if you want them more flat, you're going to leave that a couple of days. I just left mine overnight because I was making this video, and I don't really care if they're that warped because of the fact that I'm going to be painting them, so they're probably going to warp a little bit again. These are what my sheets of paper looks like after leaving them pressed for a day. So they are a lot flatter than they were previously, but they are not cut. So the next thing I'm going to do is cut these. Originally, I was going to try and cut them using my little paper cutter, but because the paper is kind of thin and fragile, it just ended up kind of tearing it. So instead, I am tracing out the shape of my A5 paper onto this paper, and then I'm taking scissors and I am cutting off the excess. So there will be more excess, even though that we made this paper with the excess of the previous scraps, there's going to be more scraps that you could use towards other paper in the future. Keep in mind, you can also do this with things like newspaper and magazines, or old papers that were from your high school notebooks. You can use that stuff. It does not have to be watercolor paper. I just used watercolor paper this time because that's what I had on hand. This is how they turned out when everything was said and done. I do plan on pressing them a little bit longer next time, and there is a lot of texture in this, but it is handmade paper, and having there be kind of a unique texture is a little bit of the charm of the paper. I ended up getting 9 full pages out of my scraps, and because I did cut these instead of leaving them with the deckled edge, I do have even more scraps that I could use in the future to create some more paper. That is all that I have for you today. Of course, like the video if you like it, comment if you want to, and subscribe if you like my content. Let me know what you want to see next time. Are there any other tutorials you'd be interested in? And do you think you would try this yourself? I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye.